I'm going to talk about the number one reason why I quit being an Uber driver and a Lyft driver, and more than that, the number one reason why I will never drive for Uber or Lyft ever again. This is going to be a very raw, unedited, fireside chat style video where I'm just going to give you the honest truth. Now, first off, jumping right into it, I hate YouTubers that ramble on. I'm going to give you a short answer and then, of course, go in depth on it and give you the longer answer with more detail. Short answer one, I will say, being transparent, that one of the main reasons why I stopped driving is because during that time, when I was driving for Uber and Lyft, I was pursuing things like YouTube and music, these kind of entrepreneurial, creative endeavors, and they did end up working out. We started making money from them. So that's one of the main reasons why I stopped. But I have had some people say, hey, Mark, okay, if let's say that didn't happen, let's say YouTube didn't work out or music didn't work out, would you still drive? The answer is no. And for one main reason, one main phrase, and that is ROI, or the return on investment. Basically, doing Uber and Lyft, driving for Uber and Lyft is just not worth it at all anymore. When you factor in all these different things I'm going to talk about in this video, it's just not worth it. The ROI is just not there for a multitude of different reasons. And this video could easily be hours long, right? I've done a lot of videos about the pros and the cons when it comes to Lyft and Uber, but here's the big thing. Just to kind of give you some bullet points, and I think every driver is definitely gonna know what I'm talking about. Here's what's unfortunate. One, you just don't make that much money anymore driving, right? And yes, there are some pros to Lyft and Uber. The big thing being, of course, the flexible schedule. We all know that. Two is instant cash outs. I can hit a button and instantly have that money in my bank account. I don't have to worry about, like, say, turning on the app and not being able to work, right? I know for a lot of people, depending on the profession or the industry, you want to get more hours, you want to get more work to make more money, and you can. There's a limited amount of hours. Not the case with Uber and Lyft, right? So there are benefits, and I'd say the average Uber driver and Lyft driver in America makes about 20 to 25 an hour, right? So to be able to go out and drive and instantly start making 20 to 25 an hour at first doesn't seem like the worst thing ever. But then when you factor in all these things I'm going to talk about, the ROI is just not there. The risk is not really worth it when you look at the risk versus reward analysis, right? So one, drivers are making kind of less than before. 20 to 25 was about the same that drivers made about a decade ago from the time of this video, about 9 or 10 years ago, right? 20 to 25 an hour does not hit the same way it used to, let's be honest. Secondly, Uber and Lyft is now taking out a bigger cut. In case you didn't know, back in the day, it was a very hard split of 20-80, meaning if I made $100, I'd walk away with 80, Uber and Lyft would get 20. Seemed pretty fair. They made the app. They were getting the people. I just turn on the app and I kind of follow the instructions, right? That was fair. Now, sometimes it's close to even half. Or I've even heard some drivers saying, no, that was 60 or 70%, or it almost seems like it's now flip-flop, where sometimes Uber and Lyft could take out even 80%. You get stuck with 20%, right? So on top of you making less money, and I might even say that money not going the distance it used to, I guess pun intended, given inflation and everything, Uber and Lyft is now taking out a bigger cut. In addition, on top of this, more drivers on the road now than ever before. This is another huge issue, right? If you look at the fact that more people are signing up to drive for Uber and Lyft every day, and there's only a finite amount of rides to go around, I've heard of some drivers saying, yeah, before I'd have no issue going out, doing tons of rides. Now it's harder to get a ride. Now it just takes longer. I know some drivers said, yeah, I now have to work almost double to make the same exact amount of money I was making a year ago, right? So you look at the financial aspect of being a driver and you're like, wow, so before it was pretty good, but now not as much. And then, of course, when you factor in things like maintenance on your car, expenses, you're gonna have to be paying for gas more. Of course, gas is more expensive now. These are all huge factors. And then on top of all this, which is kind of an inevitable thing or factor for any job, but it's something to mention to look at everything, is taxes, right? You are an independent contractor. So however much money you make, you have to realize, oh yeah, I'm going to get hit. In case you've never done a independent contractor job before in terms of the taxes, typically for most jobs, your taxes get taken out when you get each paycheck. So you get that big lump sum during tax season or a refund but in this case, you're more likely than not, unless you're driving part-time, there's other factors involved, but more likely than not, and I'm a former accountant, I'm not your accountant, I want to say that, more likely than not, you're going to owe money. And a lot of people might not be used to that. And you're like, wait a minute, so I'm making less money than before, they're taking out a bigger cut, maintenance is more expensive, there's too many drivers on the road, so it's hard to get rides. And on top of all this, if I do it full-time, more likely than not, at the end of that year, or the beginning of next year, when taxes rolls around, the IRS comes knock on your door, I'm going to owe money from even the little money I'm taking away with. again, the ROI is not there. And then I think when you look at the pros and the cons of being a driver, I think there are two main, if I look at them as global or big picture things. And the reason why, again, I stopped driving because I could see it getting worse. I also, of course, would never drive again. I think there's two main things. One is the financial aspect, like I just mentioned, but like I just touched upon pretty briefly in terms of, the low pay, all this kind of stuff. It's just getting worse. The second big glaring factor, and this too, like I said, financial stuff, if I call it that, is I'm going to say insurance stuff / just like risky stuff. And I'll go more into detail about this. The more that you're on the road, the more likely you are to get into an accident, right? This is an inevitable factor of being an Uber driver and a Lyft driver. And if you think about it, the more that you're on the road, the more it's likely to happen. If you get into an accident, that's a huge thing to worry about. So insurance issues are a big deal. This is why I suggest to a lot of drivers, make sure you have rideshare insurance. I've had so many people comment since I started mentioning this. I've mentioned this in a lot of videos. I mentioned it a lot to get rideshare insurance. And a lot of times when I do, I see comments on this channel of people saying, yeah, Mark, I got rideshare insurance. Thank God I did because I got into an accident or somebody hit me. It wasn't even my fault and my insurance didn't want to cover it, but my rideshare insurance did cover it, even though it wasn't my fault, right? Like if you don't tell your insurance company you're driving for Lyft and Uber and something happens, that could be really negative, right? And then in addition on top of this, take even not just what's happening outside your car, but inside. If like say a passenger attacks you, if there's a dispute with a passenger, if like say a passenger is getting very, very creepy to you and making you feel uncomfortable, right? There's all these situations that can arise. Now I will say, if you look at the statistics, it is far and few between. Yes, these situations do get headline news. I think the reason why is it's kind of like, I don't say clickbait, but kind of when you hear about, a passenger attacked this driver or pulled out a gun or a knife or something like that happened. It can happen, and you want to be safe, of course, and that's very important. And Uber and Lyft do have safety protocols in place, and it is rare. I will say it's like a 0.001% of rides, something like that happens, but even still, it can potentially happen. This is why I suggest to a lot of drivers, definitely have a dash cam that films not only outside of your car, but also the inside as well. And on top of all this as well, again, we're going deeper down the rabbit hole, is deactivations. In case you didn't know, when it comes to Uber and Lyft, there's been a lot of cases where, like, say, you get into a dispute with a passenger, the passenger says one thing, you say another thing, it's a he said this, but she said this situation, and Uber and Lyft says, you know what, we're going to deactivate their account, we're going to investigate this. And then to an extent, I get it, it's a tough situation, because I'm like, all right, there are some bad drivers on the road. I mean, let's be honest, there are some bad drivers. There have been Uber and Lyft drivers who've been caught driving drunk, right? So these are negative situations, and these need to be addressed. That being said, there's been a lot of situations where, like, say, you're doing nothing wrong, a passenger complains for some reason, right? They claim you're drunk, they just make something up. Uber and Lyft investigates you, and after a week, they say, okay, you know what, we're sorry, the passenger, we just reprimanded them, we realized they were lying, or they admitted they were lying or whatever. But now you just missed out on a week's worth of work, right? And I think those two big things combined make the ROI ultra negative for me. The risk is just not worth the reward. One, from the little money you're making. The little money you're making with all those factors I talked about, it's just not worth it. The ROI is just not there. And then two, when you combine all this, the risk or the insurance aspect of getting into an accident, having something happen with a passenger, your physical well-being being potentially compromised, right? Things like wrongful deactivation, where I know a lot of drivers said, yeah, after being wrongfully deactivated, now I'm always worried. Now I'm always worried if I'm driving, I get into a minor dispute with a passenger, there's this like anxiety in the back of my head saying, oh shoot, I need to drive for Uber and Lyft to make ends meet, to make money, to put food on the table, to care for my kids. When's the next time I pull up the app? When is it going to happen? Or is it going to happen when I pull up the app and then boom, I get deactivated out of nowhere again? And there's this odd anxiety, and I get that we're out of nowhere. You now do not have the ability to work. You do not have the ability to drive. And now you're like, shoot, I don't know how I'm going to make money. Granted, I will say, make sure you sign up for both Uber and Lyft if you are driving. This is a huge pro tip I have for new drivers. I have a video list below in the description to all my best pro tips for new drivers out there. And one thing I do want to say, on this video, even though this video is ultra pessimistic and very honest, I'm very transparent from my perspective, there are a lot of benefits to being a driver. And I've talked about that. Like I briefly mentioned in the beginning, like the flexible hours, great pay. I've met a lot of people who do love driving for Uber and Lyft, who said, look, Uber and Lyft changed my life. I know it changed mine. I know that sounds cheesy, but it did. When I first started driving, it was the perfect way to have a flexible schedule, to balance out, Uber and Lyft along with the music and YouTube. I'd wake up at about, I think it's like 6:45 every day. or maybe 6:30, right? 6:30, 6:45. Do the morning commuting hours, come back, work on music, do a workout, work on YouTube, go back out for the evening commuting hours, and then come back. It was the perfect way to have like a balance of making just enough money to get by or pursuing my dreams. In addition, of course, you can't be with a flexible schedule. Sometimes in addition, when I was in Boston, I mean, this is again years ago, I could be easily making 40, 50, sometimes even close to 60 an hour, especially when it would snow. I actually just interviewed or talked to one driver a couple of days ago when going out. And he was saying, yeah, he's like, I've been driving for about, I think 10 years. He's been driving for a long time. And he's like, yeah, on average, I'm not gonna lie, I make about $40-ish an hour here in LA. That is awesome, right? And there are, I do want to say, a good amount of drivers who make that. There are a good amount of drivers who do make a lot of money, a very, very good source of income, and you don't have to listen to a boss. I mean, Lyft and Uber, in my opinion, is the closest thing to having your own business or being your own boss without actually having your own business or being your own boss, right? So there are so many benefits to Uber and Lyft. I'm not saying there's not, and I do want to make that clear on this video. But that being said, when I look at the big picture of like, what is the big benefits of being a driver? What is the big negatives? The pros versus the cons. The negatives aggressively outweigh the cons. And for me, like I said, the two biggest ones, the two biggest categories are the money and then the risk, right? Because if, let's say, most drivers could consistently make 40 or 50 an hour, let's say that was the average amount for most drivers, I'd say, okay, you know what? Yeah, the risk is still there. The risk is definitely still there, right? But, I mean, at $50 an hour, at least it seems a little bit more worth it. Do you get what I'm saying? But when you look at the little amount of money drivers are making compared to all this risk you would inevitably have to deal with of being on the road and dealing with passengers and potential insurance issues and deactivation issues, it's just not there, right? And especially too, I mean, if you look at In-N-Out, for example, I've used that in a few different videos as an example. Some In-N-Out workers make like 20 something an hour, and taxes are factored in, so it's a little bit easier when it comes to the accounting and the math and the personal finance. After, I think it's 90 days of working In-N-Out, even if you're working part-time, I do believe you still get like benefits, like health insurance and stuff like that. So you still get benefits to work at In-N-Out. In addition to, I think one kind of tricky thing about Uber and Lyft, which is kind of an inevitable factor, and some businesses are like this, some businesses are not, is with Uber and Lyft, you have to spend money to make money. You have to always be getting gas. You have to always be making sure your car is properly maintained. My brother was driving for Lyft, I remember, in Denver, Colorado, and he had to replace his entire brake system because he was just putting a lot of those miles on the road, the wear and tear. In addition, when you go to resell your car, the value of it is going to be less because you're driving for Uber and Lyft, right? When you look at all these things, you have to spend money to make money with Uber and Lyft, right? You have to. With In-N-Out, to use them as an example, I'm a huge fan of In-N-Out. With In-N-Out, you don't have to. You just go to the restaurant, you commute like a typical job, you work, you don't have to spend any extra money. I guess I don't even factor in the commute as having to spend money, but I guess it's true for almost any job, unless you have a remote job. You commute there, you do your work, you come back. It is that easy, right? And again, you have to try In-N-Out if you haven't tried it. My favorite order, I'd say, is 4x4 animal style fries, animal style or animal fries. So I want to say that as a side note, right? But again, these are all the different things that really factor into Uber and Lyft just not being worth it anymore. And not only with Uber and Lyft, like I just mentioned when it comes to the In-N-Out example, but when I look at Uber and Lyft and then I compare it to other jobs, I'm just like, wait a minute. So I can do another job that is way less risk, way less risk. I don't have to worry about insurance issues. I don't have to worry about deactivation. I don't have to worry about, I don't have to worry about all these things with Uber and Lyft. Yet I make the same, if not more money. Why not just do a different job? And yes, I will say Uber and Lyft is truly the most flexible job I can possibly think of. I mean, let's be honest, right? You could turn on the app at no warning to Uber and Lyft whenever you want. You could turn it off at no warning to Uber and Lyft whenever you want. And that is true. And this is why I think for a lot of people, they look at Uber and Lyft as the perfect secondary job, which it is. And I have to admit that, given all these negative things I've talked about, it is truly the best secondary job. I would never drive for Uber and Lyft part-time or full-time. But if I was forced to, if someone said, okay, Mark, would you ever consider it? I'd say no. But at least with part-time, there are the benefits that you're like, okay, I don't have to rely on the income. I do it when I feel like it. I can drive only during the peak hours. Because in a lot of cases, if you drive in non-peak hours or a time period that's not a good time to drive, I remember there's some times on a Tuesday, I would drive from like 1 to 2 p.m. and make $4. So on top of all this, it's like there's only a true limited amount of time that you can drive where you can actually make the good money. Besides that, you're just wasting your time and your money and still incurring all these risks. It's just not worth it. I think that's the big problem. Like I said, at the end of the day, with all these videos I've made about Uber and Lyft, talking about the pros and the cons, the news stories, this is something I have wanted to talk about. I was like, the number one reason, and it's just the ROI. The return on the investment is just not there. When I look at all the pros and the cons, when I look at all the rewards you get as being a driver, like the flexible schedule and the instant cash outs, but then I look at all the risks. The risks are just unbelievably high, and the rewards are just unbelievably low.